I knew I was invisible the moment they showed me where to sit. Not near the family. Not close enough to hear the laughter clearly. At the very last table, half hidden behind a pillar. Next to strangers who didn't ask who I was. The hall was glowing with light, music, white flowers, happiness carefully arranged on every surface. People hugged, glasses clinked. Someone cried joyful tears. And I stood there for a second, holding my small gift. Smiling the way old women learn to smile when something hurts but must not be spoken. I told myself it was nothing. Weddings are busy. Young people don't notice everything. I reminded my heart to behave. When I finally sat down, I smoothed my dress over my knees and folded my hands, just like I used to do at school meetings, hospital corridors, long nights of waiting. From this table, I could see backs more than faces. I could hear laughter arrive late, like an echo that wasn't meant for me. No one looked my way. And that hurt more than being placed far away. Because I remembered hands I once held when they were small. I remembered fevered nights, first steps, quiet promises whispered into tiny ears. I remembered choosing their needs over mine without ever calling it sacrifice. The music grew louder. The bride and groom were glowing. People stood up to cheer. I clapped too, carefully, quietly, afraid my sound would be out of place. I wasn't angry. I was something worse, forgotten. Still, I told myself I am here. That should be enough. I didn't know then that a few pages folded in my bag, words written late at night with trembling hands, were about to be read out loud, and that the silence that would follow would finally make them see me. As I sat there, I watched the room the way old people do, not looking for attention, just observing. I noticed who leaned toward whom, who laughed too loudly, who checked their phone instead of watching the moment. I noticed how easy it was for joy to fill the room, and how little space there was left for memory. I told myself I didn't come here to be seen. I came because this day mattered. Because once long ago, I held this child in my arms and promised myself I would live long enough to see her happy. And here she was glowing, surrounded by flowers and music, stepping into a new life. People passed my table without stopping. Some nodded politely, unsure who I belonged to. Others didn't look at all. I felt like an old photograph placed in the wrong album, still real but no longer recognized. I thought about the mornings when I woke before sunrise to make breakfast for a house that was never quiet. About hands that learned to work early so others could rest. About words I swallowed, dreams I postponed, years I never complained about. No one asks old women what they gave up. They only ask why we are tired. The host's voice echoed through the hall, cheerful and confident. He joked, made people laugh. Announced the next part of the evening. Applause rose and fell like waves. I clapped again, smiling, always smiling. Inside my bag, the paper shifted slightly when I moved. I felt it against my side, as if reminding me it was there. I hadn't planned for it to be read. I wrote it for myself, really. A way to put years into words before they disappeared with me. I lowered my eyes when the host said, "And now, a few words of congratulations." I didn't expect to hear where they came from. My heart tightened when the host paused, shuffling his cards as if searching for something unexpected. The room leaned forward, hungry for the next laugh, the next toast, the next easy emotion. I stayed still, already used to being unnoticed. "And this one," he said lightly, "is from the grandmother." For a moment I thought he meant someone else. There are always grandmothers at weddings. Soft smiles, silver hair, polite applause. Surely not me. Not the woman sitting at the edge of the celebration, half hidden, half erased. But then he added, "She asked that it be read aloud." A quiet murmur passed through the room. Chairs shifted. Someone laughed awkwardly. I felt heat rise to my face, the kind that comes with sudden exposure, not pride. My fingers curled into my palms. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't insisted. I had only handed the envelope to a passing hand, thinking it might reach the couple later or never. The host cleared his throat. "I'll read it as written," he said. The music stopped. The clinking of glasses faded. Even the children grew quiet. From my table I could suddenly see faces turning. Curious. Expectant. Some confused, as if trying to remember who I was and why my words mattered now. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to stand up and say it was unnecessary, that simple wishes would be enough. But my legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor by years of silence. The first sentence was spoken out loud. My words, lips and someone else's voice, and something in the air changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of stillness that comes before people realize they are about to hear the truth. I lifted my eyes for the first time that evening, and for the first time they were looking back. He began to read slowly, as if sensing that rushing would break something fragile. The first lines were gentle, almost harmless. Words about love, about a new beginning, about wishing light on a shared path. People relaxed. Some smiled. This they thought was safe. But then the tone shifted. The words spoke of time, not the kind measured in years, but in moments given without being counted. Of staying when it was easier to leave. Of loving someone long before they could remember your face. I heard a breath catch somewhere in the room. My hands were shaking now. I pressed them together, afraid they would betray me. Those sentences were not meant for an audience. They were pieces of my life, laid bare without decoration. The host continued. His voice grew quieter, steadier. The laughter had vanished completely. No one reached for their glass. No one whispered. Even the light seemed too bright for what was being said. I watched faces change. A smile froze. A brow tightened. Someone looked down at their lap, suddenly uncomfortable. Others stared straight ahead, as if afraid to miss a single word. The letter spoke of standing behind the scenes, of being present without applause, of loving fiercely, even when love slowly turns into a habit others stop noticing. I didn't look at the couple. I couldn't. I stared at the tablecloth instead, tracing a small stain with my eyes, grounding myself in something ordinary. Because the next lines were no longer gentle. They were honest. And honesty, once spoken aloud, does not ask permission to be felt. The host paused for just a second before continuing, as if deciding whether to go on. Then he did. And with each sentence, the room seemed to grow smaller, tighter, as though the walls themselves were listening. The letter spoke of absence. Not the loud kind, no slammed doors, no angry goodbyes. But the quiet absence that arrives slowly, when visits become rare, calls grow shorter, and love is assumed instead of returned. I felt my throat close. Those words had taken me the longest to write. I had erased them many times, afraid they sounded like blame. I never wanted to accuse anyone. I only wanted to be understood just once. Someone near the front shifted in their chair. I heard a sharp inhale. A woman reached for a tissue she hadn't expected to need. The host read on. About waiting. About setting an extra plate out of habit. About learning not to ask for help. Because everyone is always busy building their own happiness. From my table I could see shoulders stiffen. Faces that had been glowing with celebration now looked older, heavier. People were no longer guests. They were witnesses. I thought of all the times I said, "I'm fine," when I wasn't. Of all the birthdays spent quietly. Of illnesses endured without complaint, because I didn't want to be a burden. The letter did not beg for gratitude. It did not ask to be remembered. It simply said that love, when left unanswered for too long, becomes a quiet kind of pain. And the silence in the hall grew so deep, it felt like a held breath, one no one dared to release. The host's voice lowered even more, almost respectful now, as if he had stepped into a place that did not belong to him. The words no longer floated, they settled. They stayed. The letter spoke of aging. Not with fear but with truth. Of how the body slows down long before the heart does. Of how memories remain sharp, even when hands begin to tremble. Of how an old woman can still love with the same strength she once carried a child in her arms. I felt exposed yet strangely calm. There was relief in not hiding anymore. In letting the room hear what is usually said only to walls and pillows late at night. Someone in the crowd quietly sat down after realizing they had been standing this whole time. A glass slipped from nervous fingers and clinked softly against the table, far too loud in the stillness. No one laughed. The host read about pride. About choosing dignity over complaint. About smiling through neglect because love should never be used as a weapon. I saw eyes glisten. I saw lips pressed together. A man near the aisle wiped his face quickly and looked away, embarrassed by his own reaction. I thought of how often old women are expected to fade politely, to be grateful for scraps of attention, to accept distance as normal. The letter did not accept that. It spoke gently, but it stood firm. It said that love does not expire. That being old does not mean being finished. That presence still matters, even when it comes quietly. The host swallowed before continuing. And I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The next lines changed everything. The letter spoke of forgiveness, not as something demanded, but as something already given. It said that I did not hold anger in my heart, only tiredness. That I understood how life pulls people away, how days fill up, how priorities shift without permission. A soft murmur moved through the room and then died instantly, as if no one dared interrupt the moment. Forgiveness spoken out loud is unsettling. It leaves no place to hide. The host read about love that does not keep score, about never listing sacrifices because true care is not a transaction, about choosing to believe in the goodness of those who forget you. My eyes burned, but I did not cry. I had done enough of that in private. This was not a moment for tears. This was a moment for truth to stand on its own. I noticed the bride lower her head. Just slightly. I noticed hands tighten around each other. I noticed how no one was smiling anymore, yet no one looked away. The letter said that forgiveness does not erase pain. It simply refuses to let pain become bitterness. That growing old teaches you what is worth carrying, and what must be set down, even if it still hurts. The host's voice faltered for the first time. He stopped, took a breath, and continued more slowly. Because the letter was no longer about the past. It was turning toward the future. And everyone in that room felt it coming. The words now spoke directly to the couple. Not as advice shouted from above, but as a quiet hope offered from below. The letter wished them patience. Not the easy kind, but the patience that stays when love becomes work. When days are long and silence creeps in where laughter once lived. The hall felt different. The celebration had paused, suspended in something deeper than joy. People listened the way they listen at funerals and births, aware that something important was passing through them. I heard my own words describing how love changes shape, but should never lose its care. How it must be protected, especially when it feels ordinary. How neglect rarely begins with cruelty, but with distraction. The host read about remembering those who stood quietly behind you. Those who never demanded a place at the table, yet built it with their own hands. I could feel eyes on me now. Not curious eyes. Not confused ones. These were heavy looks, filled with recognition that arrives too late but still matters. The bride finally turned. Our eyes met for a second, just one. Hers were full. Mine were steady. I gave her the smallest nod, the kind that says, I am not here to hurt you. The letter wished them a home where no one feels small, where age is not pushed aside, where love is practiced daily, not assumed. The host's voice grew tight again, because the letter was nearing its end, and endings, when they come with truth, never leave things the way they were before. The final paragraphs were the quietest, not because they were weak but because they carried no defense, only acceptance. The letter said that one day, the hall would be empty, the music would fade, the flowers would dry. What would remain were not photos or dresses, but memories of how people were treated when no one was watching. A collective breath moved through the room. Someone sobbed softly and didn't bother to hide it. The host read about absence again, but this time the kind that is permanent. About chairs that will stay empty, voices that will no longer answer, hands that once waited, now resting. I stared straight ahead. These words had cost me the most. Writing them felt like saying goodbye to a future I knew would not be long. The letter did not accuse. It reminded. It asked them gently to remember the living while they still breathe, to sit closer, to listen longer, to love more deliberately. The host's voice broke on the last sentence. He stopped. For a moment no one moved. No applause. No music. Just the raw stillness of a room that had been changed without permission. Then he folded the paper carefully. And that, he said quietly, was the grandmother's message. All eyes turned toward my table, and I finally stood up. Standing up felt harder than sitting through the silence. My knees protested, my balance wavered for a brief second. And in that pause I felt every year of my life. But I stood anyway. Slowly. Without drama. The room watched me the way people watch something fragile, unsure whether to help or simply stay still. I did not smile. I had nothing left to offer in that way. I nodded once, not to ask for attention, but to acknowledge what had been shared. The letter was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had heard themselves in it. Someone near the front began to clap, then stopped, realizing applause would be wrong. Others followed that instinct, hands half raised, uncertain. The silence returned deeper than before. I looked toward the couple at last. They were both crying openly now. Not the delicate tears of happiness, but the kind that come when something inside finally breaks open. I did not step closer. This was not the moment for comfort. I simply placed my hand over my heart. That gesture carried everything I could not say aloud: love, forgiveness, fatigue, and hope tangled together. I thought of all the times I stood for others without being noticed. This time being seen did not feel like victory. Felt like release. The host stepped aside, giving me space without asking me to speak. He understood, finally, that some messages do not need another voice. I remained standing for a moment longer. Then I sat back down, and the celebration, when it returned, was no longer the same. The music eventually began again, softer than before, as if the speakers themselves were unsure they were allowed to be loud. People moved carefully now. Conversations were hushed. Laughter, when it appeared, sounded different, restrained, thoughtful. A few guests glanced toward my table, then quickly away like children caught staring. Others held my gaze for a second longer, their eyes full of something close to apology, though no words followed. I did not expect anyone to come to me, and yet, one by one they did. A woman I barely recognized squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you." For what, she didn't say. A man nodded at me from a distance, his jaw tight, as if holding back something unfinished. I listened more than I spoke. Old habits are hard to break. The bride's mother passed by several times without stopping. Each time her steps slowed. Each time she hesitated. And each time she kept going. I understood. Some truths take longer to approach. From my chair I watched the couple move through the room, accepting congratulations that now carried weight. They smiled, but their eyes searched constantly, as if looking for something they had misplaced. I did not wave. I did not call them over. I had already said enough. For the first time that evening, I felt tired in an honest way. Not the tiredness of being overlooked, but the fatigue that follows when a long-held breath is finally released. And I wondered whether this night would end here, or if the hardest moment was still waiting. It came quietly, not with an announcement, not with music, just the soft sound of footsteps approaching my table, slower than the rest of the room. I looked up and saw the bride standing there. No crowd, no cameras, just her, holding the edge of the chair as if unsure whether she was allowed to sit. For a moment neither of us spoke. Words had been used enough tonight. "I didn't know," she finally said, her voice thin and unsteady. It wasn't an excuse. It was a realization. I nodded once. Not in agreement, not in dismissal, simply acknowledgement. Knowing often comes late. That does not make it meaningless. She sat down beside me, ignoring the empty seats closer to the center of the hall. Around us the celebration continued, but it felt far away, like noise from another life. "I thought you were always okay," she whispered. I smiled then. A real smile. A sad one. "That's what we teach you," I replied softly. "To believe that love doesn't need care." Her eyes filled again. She reached for my hand, hesitant, as if afraid I might pull away. I didn't. Her fingers were warm. Alive. I didn't tell her everything would be fine. Old women learn not to promise what life may refuse to give. Instead I said, "Sit with me for a while." And she did. From the last table in the hall. Together. We sat there longer than anyone expected. Long enough for people to notice. Long enough for whispers to travel from table to table, changing shape as they moved. I felt the weight of those glances, but they no longer pressed on me the way they had before. She stayed close, her shoulder lightly touching mine, as if afraid distance might return the moment she let go. I let her. Sometimes love needs permission to come nearer. "I don't want you to leave early," she said quietly, almost like a child afraid of the dark. "I wasn't planning to," I answered. And for the first time it was true. Across the room the groom watched us. At first uncertain, then thoughtful. Finally he walked over, slower than necessary, giving himself time to understand what he was stepping into. He didn't speak right away. He simply pulled out a chair. No one invited him. He knew he should sit anyway. We formed a small island at that forgotten table, 3 generations bound not by tradition, but by a moment that refused to pass unnoticed. The music swelled again, but this time it felt like background, not command. I saw something shift in him too. Not guilt alone, something deeper. Awareness. The kind that changes how you carry people forward. "I'm glad you came," he said, meeting my eyes directly. "So am I," I replied. And I meant it more than he could know. Because being seen even late still matters. And because this table, once the farthest away, was no longer where I felt alone. Not everyone understood what was happening, and that was all right. Some things are not meant to be explained aloud. They are meant to be felt, then carried home in silence. People returned to dancing. Plates were cleared. New songs replaced the old ones. The wedding found its rhythm again. But it moved differently now, softer around the edges, more careful with its joy. The bride stayed with me through it all. She laughed when others laughed, but her hand never left mine for long. Each time she stood, she looked back, as if making sure I was still there. I watched her the way I used to long ago, quietly with pride that asks for nothing. The years between us no longer felt like distance. They felt like a bridge finally crossed from both sides. At some point, the groom's parents joined us. No speeches. No apologies dressed as explanations. Just chairs pulled closer, knees turned toward mine, eyes lowered in respect. It was enough. I realized then that the letter had done what I could not. It had opened a door without forcing anyone through it. The table was no longer the last one. It had become a place people returned to, drawn by something they could not name. And as I sat there, surrounded by movement and music, I felt something settle inside me. Peace. Not perfect. Not complete. But real. Later, when the hall began to thin and the night leaned toward its end, someone asked if I was tired. I smiled and said yes, not because I wanted to leave but because I wanted them to care. They helped me stand. This time, hands reached for me without hesitation. Not out of pity but out of presence. I accepted them without pride or resistance. Age teaches you when to hold on. The bride walked me slowly across the floor. Guests stepped aside to make room, not because they were told to, but because they understood. The music softened again, following us like a breath held in respect. Near the exit I paused. I looked back at the room, the lights, the tables, the flowers already wilting slightly at the edges. A beautiful evening. A complicated one. "I'm glad you spoke," the bride whispered. "I'm glad you listened," I answered. Outside the air was cool and honest. The noise faded behind us. For a moment we stood there, neither wanting to rush away from what had just been repaired. I knew this night would be remembered. Not for the dress or the songs, but for the moment when love was rearranged. They hugged me carefully, as if I were something precious and breakable. I held them both longer than expected. Then I turned and walked toward my ride. I did not look back. Some endings don't need witnesses. The ride home was quiet. Streetlights passed like slow thoughts, each one reminding me how many nights I had spent awake, wondering if I still mattered. Tonight I didn't wonder. I simply breathed. My gift bag rested on my lap, lighter than when I arrived. Not because something was missing, but because something heavy had been set down. I felt older and somehow younger too. At home I took off my shoes and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of a place that knows you completely. The clock ticked. The walls waited. I was no longer afraid of them. I thought of the last table, of how easily a place of exclusion can turn into a place of truth. How distance can vanish the moment someone chooses to step closer. I folded the memory of the night the way I fold letters I plan to keep, carefully, without rushing. This was not a victory. It was not a lesson taught. It was connection returned. Before going to bed, I placed the copy of my letter in a drawer. I would not need to read it again. Its work was done. As I lay down I felt no regret. Only gratitude for words spoken, for silence honored, for love that finally sat beside me instead of far away. Sleep came gently, and I let it. Morning came quietly, the way it always does when life continues without asking permission. Sunlight touched the curtain, soft and patient. I woke without the familiar heaviness in my chest. For the first time in a long while, I did not replay yesterday in my mind to see what I should have done differently. There was nothing to correct. Nothing to swallow back. I made tea and sat by the window watching people hurry somewhere important. I wondered how many of them carried words they were afraid to say. How many sat at their own last tables, waiting to be noticed. My phone buzzed once. A short message. Did you sleep well? Nothing more. Nothing dramatic. I smiled. Love does not always return as an apology. Sometimes it returns as presence. As a chair pulled closer. As a question asked without obligation. I knew there would still be quiet days. Distance does not vanish overnight. Old habits do not dissolve because of one evening. But something had shifted, and that was enough. I was no longer invisible. And I no longer needed to prove that I existed. If this was the last big moment given to me, it had been honest. If there were more ahead, I would meet them without fear. I finished my tea while it was still warm. And for the first time in many years, I felt certain of one simple truth. I had always been worthy of a place at the table.